back to Murphy's Garage. Thanks for joining me, and I would greatly appreciate it if you like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Last time we got the engine ready to go. This time is going to be a hectic little video. I've got a lot of things going on that kind of had to happen all at once. We're going to get a transmission bolted to this engine. We're going to get a whole bunch of the wiring gutted. We're going to get the standalone harness completed. We're going to be wiring a bunch of the chassis. We're going to change some stuff in the instrument cluster. And we're going to have to at least plumb the fuel system and the transmission so that when we do a test fire, we don't have fluids blowing out all over the place. Transmission tech talk time. That's not me. Transmissions were not my forte when I was working in the field. I can muddle my way through them. I'm really slow at them. I haven't done enough of them to really be super efficient and know a lot of the ins and outs. But like I said, I could muddle my way through it if I had to. My transmission for this build was kind of an easy choice for me. I went a little overboard on the engine rebuild and some of the bling I'm putting under this hood. So I figured I could save a few bucks with a good used transmission that I happen to already own. That transmission is a 4L80E. I have nothing against that transmission at all. It's a very strong transmission. It's a 32 spline output, 6-bolt input on the torque converter. They use big planetaries in them. To be honest with you, I've got a 4L80E and a pickup that has 390,000 miles on it, and the only transmission work that's been done on it was fluid and filter service. So in my opinion, it's a really good transmission. Now I could have gone with a 6L80E if I'd have stumbled across one of those. I don't think they're quite as strong as a 4L80E, but they do have a really low first gear, which I would have probably taken if I had the chance. Now I don't know much about some of the new 8 and 10-speed transmissions, but I know they're really expensive, so free was the best route for me to take at this point. And all I'm really going to do to this transmission, because I know it works, is I'll drain the converter, put a new front pump seal in it, service the filter and gasket, clean and paint, and it'll go in. And I know it works because I drove the truck with it in it. So that's where we're going to go next. This is the mounting surface for the 4L80E. You can see those 6 bolts I was talking about. The old Turbo 400s, for instance, had 3. And where your engine connects to the transmission, I think more is better. And this is a short shaft 32 spline 4-wheel drive transmission, so it'll go right in. Once I pulled the converter and changed the front pump seal, I mounted the transmission to an engine stand. Was able to clean it up a little easier that way. Changed the filter, the pan gasket, and then I also replaced the electronic module on the side of it for the shifter. Pulled the front clip off of this thing, got the engine all unbolted and ready to pull out. Once it's out, the next step's transmission. Transmission transfer case then came out all as one unit. There was no way I was going to put a new engine into a nasty old engine compartment, so I pulled what I could off, spent some time, cleaned it all up, and started reassembling it. Got all the firewall done in areas where there wasn't paint. I repainted it in black, which you can see on the sides and down by the bell housing. And then I also cleaned up the frame rails, frame horns, and painted them. With the front clip off, you can see those big plates I mounted to the frame for the winch and the front bumper. I went ahead and added some welded structure in while I had the front clip off. I couldn't get to it with the clip on when I did the bumper. Generally, on engine mounts, I'll make my own. I'll cut all the tube, cut all the plates, I'll get everything angled correctly and set up correctly, and then just weld them in. Now this time, I had so much going on all at once, I just went ahead and bought a set of prefabricated, pre-designed engine mounts. These bolted into the engine really nice. Now this is their earliest version of the mounts. I actually really like their newest version. but you can see the engine set right on those frame horns from the factory. It sets really, really level, which is a huge thing to me. More importantly, it has the right tilt, and that tilt is really important when you go to line up a water pump and a fan. And then while I'm editing this video, I run into Sam. He's the proprietor of Flying Iron Fabrication, who designs and builds these mounts. So I cornered him at his table here. Take notice. Sam designed the engine mounts that I used in this, and something he didn't make at the time I did this, these frame horns. So I'm going to let him tell you about these.
So we got the frame horns made out of 1/4-inch steel. The motor mounts are made out of 1/4-inch and 3/16, and these are just an exact replacement for your factory AMC V8 engine mounts, or engine frame horns. They're just heavy duty, they don't crack like the factory ones, and the motor mounts make it an easy LS swap for you. I also offer AMC V8 mounts if needed. You can find them at my website, www.flyingironfabrication.com. I also have them made for multiple bolt patterns, so they will fit on every 1963 to 91 full-size Jeep, including the M715s.
Cool, and yeah, I just saw a guy doing a 715 swap. It looks like they fit right in. Cool. I don't even know what this is, but I guess I can ask.
This is a tow hook kit I just came out with. It has the frame plates on the side here, so it ties into plenty of mounting points so you don't tear your front frame horns off. This is made out of all 1/4-inch and 3/16 steel, bolts to these 10,000 pound rated tow hooks. And right now we have them fitting every 1979 and newer full-size Jeep, and we are working on earlier style mounting brackets for the earlier 3-piece bumpers.
I wish I'd have known Flying Iron made that tow hook kit. Just the side plates in that center section could have saved me 10 or 12 hours of fabrication when I built that bumper and winch mount for this thing. Continuing on the engine now, I got the air conditioning compressor in, the headers in, the coil packs on, alternator, power steering, and master cylinder so I could get everything worked around it. Next part of this is I took an original harness, cut it down, and made it into a standalone harness. Well, this is the input to the computer. There's a whole bunch of wire mess. I was careful to disconnect everything as I pulled this harness apart, so everything's usable. I'll be cutting and taping all the pieces I don't need, and we'll see what we end up with. After a lot of work, a lot of wire cutting, a lot of taping, and a lot of reading and following diagrams and directions of the 1,000 people that have done this before me, I'm just about ready to go. It's got its own small fuse box with the appropriate relays for fan and fuel pump, and there's about 5 wires that connect this to the Jeep to make it work. Knowing what I know now, I would recommend buying a ready-made aftermarket harness instead. Also, you're going to have the computer flash, but I always recommend either photograph or write down all your service information on the computer so you know what you've got. And here you can see I've started installing the harness, making sure everything is routed nice and clean. At the same time, I've started rewiring the entire chassis to this Jeep and pulling wire through. I did have to install the grill at this time. There's a lot of wiring that goes in the grill and across the grill. I've also started gutting the rest of the wire in the dash. It looks like a mess, but it's really organized confusion. On the passenger side of the vehicle, I've started installing all the battery cables. The positives go into the alternator, the winch, the starter, and the negative. And you can see on the negative cable, I've installed a 200 amp super fuse. I always install fuses at breakpoints. I'd rather have it pop a fuse than start burning up wires. Back on the driver's side on the firewall, I've got the fuse boxes mounted. The upper fuse box is for key on accessories. The lower fuse box is 12 volt constant. Every circuit I wire on this thing is isolated and fused independently. Back under the dash, I've got a whole bunch of the wire run, but you can also see I've got the instrument cluster out, which I'm going to be making some modifications to. You can see I've got a volt gauge in this instrument cluster. Now these came with amp gauges in them, and I converted it to a volt gauge. The reason I did that is these amp gauges were rated at 60 amps for the factory alternator. When I do these conversions, you now have a 130 amp alternator, which, say you're using your winch, you've got a potential of 130 amps from the alternator going through your dash and back to the battery. That could create a whole bunch of meltdown things and fire. And having a fire in the cockpit is really, really a bad day. So that's something I wanted to avoid. I start with a SunPro voltmeter gauge kit. I've been getting them off of eBay, but lately they've been hard to find. So if you're going to do this conversion, start looking for one of these. You may not be able to do it if you can't get one. After you get one of these volt gauges, you have to take it apart. And make sure when you take it apart, you mark the poles so when you reassemble it, you don't reverse the polarity and burn it up. Next thing, once you have your old amp gauge out, you need to take a Dremel or a burr and start egg shaping these two mounting holes so that the gauge will fit in the cluster. Just be careful when you're doing this not to damage the printed circuit board on the back. Next, install the volt gauge, making sure that the sweep hand doesn't interfere with the oil pressure gauge above. If it does, just clearance it a little bit more. After that, you want to flip it over and just wire the volt gauge to the positive and negative. I install the faceplate, and I also cut out the little volt indicator out of the SunPro gauge and glue it on my faceplate to make it look right. This is what the dash looks like all put back together. The volt gauge fits right in. That light on the left, I wired in one of the old 4x4 light sockets for something and turned it into the check engine light. Now, if you don't want to do this conversion, Jeep Recyclers is now making a replacement cluster that has a volt gauge in it. So if you don't want to do this, you can always buy one. Back under the engine compartment, I got the computer mounted to the fender well, and then I finished up the harnesses going to both fuse boxes, and that small fuse box on the left is the one for my standalone engine harness. One relay goes to the fuel pump, the other one is for a fan. I'm not using the fan one, but you never know, in the future I might start. A couple of those fuses are just spares, but every circuit in that standalone harness is now fused as well. After I got all the wires connected from the engine harness to the chassis harness, I made sure everything was loomed, routed, clamped, zip tied, as neat as possible. There's just a lot of wire under the hood of this. Remember the first video when I retrofit the gas tank for fuel injection with the dash 6 lines and AN fittings? Here's where that comes into play. The pressure and return line go down the driver's side frame rail. I don't know what that original bracket was for, but I trimmed it a little bit and it holds the fuel filter just beautifully. Also, you can see on the top the wire harness that comes back from the front down the frame rail. Next, I used the same dash 6 line and AN fittings and plumbed the transmission, which is on the passenger side. I ran the hose up and over the top of the transmission to a standalone derail cooler. This is a 25 stack self-contained thermostatically controlled transmission cooler. It's mounted to the floor of the driver's side with about a 1/2 inch air gap above it, so it has plenty of room to pull airflow through. Me being paranoid about electrical fan failure, even though this is a bigger cooler than this transmission really needs, I also mounted this 2-pass finned heat sink type transmission cooler up on the floor in the back. This way, if that fan motor does burn up, I've got enough transmission cooling capacity to drive this thing home without burning up a transmission. With all the lines correctly routed, clamped, secured, so that they won't have any future problems with chafing or leaking, it's now time to test fire this engine. complaints on how that sounds for an initial start. After that, I installed the Pretty Stuff, which I got from BJ's, for an overflow container and a windshield washer container. Where I initially mounted the computer was too far out. It interfered with the hood, so I remounted it in. I also thought this Chief was pretty appropriate to mount on the intake cover. Next, I installed the heater hoses. I also got a set of fittings from Jeep Air along with the hoses for a GM compressor, and then I routed them with the new fittings and to the evaporator and condenser with the correct fittings on that side as well from Jeep Air. Once they were all marked in clock rotation and length, I had them crimped at the local parts store, and my AC will be ready to charge. Still waiting for my Atlas transfer case to show up, so the transmission's still sitting on a couple blocks of wood on a cross member, so I'm going to continue under the hood. I plumbed in a cold air intake from the throttle plate over to a self-contained sealed air cleaner. Then I ran this accordion hose up and around to the original cold air intake port on the front of the grill. Got the radiator installed, the fan shroud installed, and then I went around to the parts house just looking for the right shape and size of radiator hoses. Got those in, didn't have to use universal type. With everything hooked up, I burped the cooling system, topped it all off. I did want to take a quick shot of the front of this. You can see how well that fan fits in the shroud, but now it's time to warm her up. I like how it sounds. I really like that mild lope at idle. Everything's pretty much done under the hood. Time to reinstall the hood. I pulled off all that old insulation, and the factory didn't even paint under there. It was just primer. So I sectioned it off and painted it black and made it look nice. I think it came out pretty good. It kind of looks good under the hood now too. My Atlas finally showed up, so in the next video we'll finish the drivetrain off and get this thing rolling. Well, thanks for watching. Please like, share, subscribe to my videos. I really appreciate it. Next video, we will finish up the last few little things on this Cherokee Chief build, do a little wrap up and test drive and go four-wheeling. The four-wheeling is the fun part. After that, I'll start on our next video series, which will be much shorter than this one. It's a much shorter build, and we'll talk more about that next time. Thanks again.